I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 77th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This episode is going to be kind of a duel or a cage match or a pick a winner kind of scenario between lots of different ways of getting omega-3 fatty acids into your system. Omega-3 fatty acids extremely important in keeping your heart and brain, and I guess your entire circulatory system really healthy and properly functioning. And something that most people are not really taking care of in their normal diet. We have this balance that we ought to maintain between omega-6 fatty acids and omega-3 fatty acids. But the standard American diet, standard Western diet is sadly way too heavy on the omega-6s most of the time. People can have 15-to-1 ratios, 20-to-1 ratios in favor of omega-6s, and it really should be kind of more like 2 to 3-to-1 depending on which nutritionist you ask. But either way, for most people, getting some omega-3 supplementation into their diet is a pretty good idea. So the question with this episode is going to be, what kind of supplementation? We're going to be talking with an omega-3 expert, Dr. Michael D. Lewis, who is a Smart Drug Smarts alumnus. We had him on an earlier episode talking about some of the work he's done with treating traumatic brain injuries with hyperdoses of omega-3 fatty acids. So we'll be revisiting that just a little and then talking about the pros and cons of different ways of getting omega-3s into your diet, both from natural food sources, supplementation, and even vegan ways to do it. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I've been doing a bunch of history reading recently, and I came across something I hadn't heard about, which was the performance-enhancing drug of choice for the Nazis. So if you're into weird stuff like that, hang around for the ruthless listener retention gimmick. But as usual, to kick things off, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So there's some interesting research being done into how the brain figures out where the body is physically positioned in space, which is obviously a pretty important thing for the brain to kind of have like a mental model of where we physically are in our environment so we can move through it, manipulate objects, do all that important interacting with the real physical universe stuff. That's kind of the main reason that we got a brain to begin with. Now, there's multiple senses that are feeding information to the brain that kind of gets distilled down into this mental model. We got a sense of touch, sense of vision, and then something called proprioception, which is kind of like the kinesthetic sense of where your limbs and stuff are in relation to each other. And all of these are inputs to your brain's mental modeling, but beyond knowing that they're all sort of factored in somehow, the details of how the mental model is created is not very well understood. And so, as is often a good way of breaking down a complex system, scientists are cutting out one of the table legs and seeing in what way the system breaks. And in this case, what they're doing is they're using local anesthetics to take away the sense of touch and then seeing how that affects the mental model that is then created. Now, if you've ever been to the dentist, you've got Novocaine at some point, a local anesthetic, and that can make your mouth and tongue and lips feel really weird. It feels like it's swollen up and balloony and you can't talk right. And then you look in the mirror and you're surprised to find that, hey, your face isn't this cartoonish, bloated thing. You look exactly like you normally do, but it feels all weird because this internal mental representation of your physicality that we're talking about had been gummed with. The scientists wanted to have a little bit more detail on exactly how the perceived changes to the body are feeling to a person in the absence of touch. And so lips wouldn't have been a very good example because a lip is kind of this pliable, amorphous thing anyway. So what they chose is fingers. And they gave local anesthetics to people's fingers so they couldn't feel anything, and then tested them to see how they perceived the fingers to have changed in shape. What they found that was interesting was that people perceived the fingers to have gotten fatter, but not longer. They perceived almost a 1/3 change in width, but less than a 3% change in length, and in some cases a 0% change in length. So a weird takeaway here is that the brain apparently processes length and width differently in this internal mental model of our physical selves. The scientists are speculating, and this is kind of interesting, they don't have data to back this up, that maybe when a nerve stops working, there's the assumption that the brain makes that, hey, there must have been an injury. If there's an injury, then we might have an open wound. So let's give ourselves sort of an extra diameter of space around our environment. Let's make ourselves feel fatter than we really are so we don't bump into things with a potentially open wound. What I like thinking about with research like this is it seems like, we have so much progress that we've made in visual systems and real-time computer graphics that are almost photorealistic right now, and they're making progress in giving vision back to blind people, but we don't really have much of a way of creating fake tactile perceptions, at least that I'm aware of, but this seems like it would be an interesting inroad. Imagine if your first-person shooter video game, right now it's like you see the hands of the character you're playing or whatever, and maybe the weapons he's holding, but what if you could feel like a 12-foot-tall ogre running down a hallway rather than just being a pimply-faced 14-year-old feeling like you're in a pimply-faced 14-year-old's body while you're looking at an ogre running down a hallway. There's probably some good medical applications for all this too. I don't know why I went to video games right off the bat, but let's move on. And I'd like to throw out a couple of thank yous to various and sundry Smart Drug Smarts listeners on iTunes. Someone by the name of Anonymous Slave left us a 5-star review saying, "Concise and informative. I really love the information and the format in which it is presented. The quality of the guests that they interview is often astonishing." So thank you, Anonymous Slave. You are anything but anonymous in our book. And yeah, these podcast reviews are really, really helpful for moving us up the iTunes rankings. So if you want to help Smart Drug Smarts in the podcast popularity contest, leaving us a nice review is a super great way to do it. Also appreciated are the people that have been taking the time to fill out the Smart Drug Smarts audience census that we've had up since the beginning of the month. We're closing the doors on that census as of the end of May. So got about a week left, a little more. To get yourself over to smartdrugsmarts.com/census. We're just looking to kind of find out more about the demographics, but the form is real quick. It only takes maybe 2, 3, 4 minutes if you're going slow, and it is a super big help to us. And once it's June and we've closed it off and we kind of have a better sense of who filled it out in our highly unscientific study, because this will be a self-selected group, not a random sampling, so it doesn't necessarily mean it's representative of the real listenership, but nevertheless, we'll tabulate what we got and put that up on the website so we can find out, all of us at the same time, who our other Smart Drug Smarts listeners are.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we're going to be talking with Dr. Michael D. Lewis, MD, MPH, MBA, FACPM. I have no idea what FACPM is. I could look that up. But for these purposes, just assume that he's a very well-educated guy. Dr. Lewis is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he actually served over 31 years in the Army, among other things running the primary care and flight medicine clinics at the Pentagon. More recently, he has several years of experience developing military programs around the use of omega-3 fatty acids in the treatment of traumatic brain injuries and even for suicide prevention. So he's working with things like rehabilitation from physical and psychological trauma, concussions, strokes, post-traumatic stress disorder, lots of really high-impact stuff. We're going to be talking not so much about medical uses of omega-3s in this episode, but instead about how to actually acquire the omega-3s, about how to get those into your system through your diet. It's worth having a little bit of a cartoon understanding of what omega-3s are as we dive into this conversation. Basically, omega-3 fatty acids are what we think of as the types of fats that are found in seafoods, fish oil, krill oil, and omega-3s are also found in some plant foods, things like avocados, flaxseed, and I think artichoke as well. Basically, any kind of fatty vegetable. If you think of a vegetable, it has some natural oils in it. Those oils are almost always going to be omega-3s. The same holds true, I think, to a lesser extent for nuts. Nuts tend to have both high levels of omega-6s and omega-3s, although this is going to vary on a nut-by-nut basis, so you'd want to probably do a little research on that. But generally, when we're thinking about getting dietary omega-3s, we're thinking mostly about seafood sources. And that's mostly what we'll be talking about today with Dr. Michael Lewis. When you go to your health food store and you're looking at this row upon row upon row of fish oil, krill oil, molecularly distilled this, farm-raised that, which of these things should you really care about? So with that as preamble, let's jump into the interview. The first thing to start talking about might be EPA and DHA. Those are sort of the two subcomponents of omega-3 fatty acids that people hear about being very important. Could you maybe break down what those are, the differences between those two compounds, and why they're important?
EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, is a 20-carbon chain molecule that has some very interesting characteristics versus if it gets elongated and a little bit of desaturation, it can become docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, which is 22 carbon as far as the length of the chain. That's the technical difference between the two. But what's fascinating is where are they found and what do they do and what are their downstream effects. One thing to note is ALA, or alpha-linolenic acid, which is 18 carbon as far as length, which you typically find in flaxseed, dark leafy green vegetables, and so on, is an incredibly good source of omega-3s. However, the human body doesn't have the capability of elongating and desaturating very efficiently to EPA and subsequently to DHA. So in studies that have been done at NIH and other places where they'll take carbon radio labeled ALA and see how much of it gets absorbed and elongated into DHA, the studies have actually been shown to be amazingly not very efficient. And one case I remember, there's a particular study from the NIH that showed it was the conversion from ALA to DHA was about 0.04%. And most people, it's typically less than 1 or 2%. Women tend to convert a little bit more, but still it's only around 1 or 2%. The other thing is that it's a really good substitute instead of eating omega-6s, which the American diet is, we're swimming in. So I would never discourage anybody from consuming ALA. It's an important part of our diet. It's an underappreciated part of our diet. There is some belief that there may be some actual direct action on neurology type of things, whether it's to help with brain function and so on, but it's really not been that well studied. What's much more known is the actions of EPA and DHA. And the best sources of that is typically from marine sources, from seafood, whether it's the small feeder fish or whether it's the larger up the chain type of fish, even swordfish and so on. But the one best known is salmon, of course.
So where's the ratio between the bioavailability in the fish sources versus the vegetarian sources?
That's actually a really good question. Partly one of the reasons, which I know you wanted to get into, is what might be some of the percentages of absorption bioavailability, because I know one of the questions that comes up very often actually is, what about krill oil?
Mm-hmm.
So there's really, in basic terms, 4 forms of omega-3s. If you're consuming seafood, if you're eating salmon, you're consuming omega-3s in the triglyceride form. So there's 3 branches off of a glycerin backbone. So that's what nature gives us. One of the questions is, of course, how do fish get their omega-3s? And fish get their omega-3s from eating algae, actually. And so they are much more efficient at processing shorter omega-3s. And that's through a process of bio-accumulation, as in little fish eat algae and medium fish eat little fish and big fish eat medium fish. Those omega-3s get more and more concentrated, along with other things as well. So you've got triglycerides, which is the most prevalent form in nature. It also brings up one of the concepts of sources of omega-3s. Not only can we get a good amount of omega-3s from fish, but we can also get omega-3s directly from algae. There are different types of algae that are higher in DHA or higher in EPA or higher in ALA. And so, interestingly enough, the NASA space program back in the 1980s set out to figure out where the best sources of algae are in order to be able to make omega-3s that they could use on the space station or on long-term space flight. And eventually they ended up getting rid of the program, but the scientists were so enthralled with it that they started their own company called Martech Biosciences. And they've been the biggest source of algae-based omega-3s in the United States for a number of years, starting around 2002, in fact. They were able to start putting their DHA from algae, completely derived from algae, never through fish. They were basically able to start to put it into infant formula. So now infant formula, 100% of it on the U.S. market has algae-based DHA in it.
How are they as far as cost parity with getting it the old-fashioned way from hunting or farming fish?
Well, it's a scalability. So basically, the way I look at it, I've never actually been to the factories or anything, but if I remember correctly, they have one major production facility, I think in Kentucky. And essentially, we're talking like a 1 million gallon test tube where they basically grow the algae and they skim off the oil that the algae makes and refine it and get it into the process. Martech was bought out by DSM, a Dutch food conglomerate, a couple of years ago, but they're still around. They still market things as Martech, sometimes as DSM, but they do a lot of third-party supply. So if you see an algae-based omega-3 on the store shelf, probably if you look closely, it'll probably have something called Life's DHA as a little symbol somewhere on the label. And that Life's DHA comes from Martech DSM. So that's algae, which is sort of a direct source in addition to the fish. Interestingly enough, get back to the absorption, one of the things is how do you make a fish oil capsule? Now, I'm not a manufacturer, but as I understand it, the way that the fish oil is essentially made in very basic terms is that in order to be able to clean it, remember I talked about the bio-accumulation. Well, not only is it a bio-accumulation for EPA and DHA, but also the bad things, the PCBs, the heavy metals, the mercury, and so on. And so when we talk about molecular distillation, that's the main process for essentially cleaning the omega-3s and getting rid of all the bad things. A good quality fish oils, you have much less risk of any kind of exposure to mercury, PCBs, and heavy metals than you would from eating actual fish itself. So what happens there is chemically they break the backbone. They cleave off the triglycerides and create free fatty acids. So those three branches now become free fatty acids because they're no longer attached to the glycerin backbone. Part of that process is that they combine the free fatty acid with an alcohol molecule or ethanol. So now you have an ethanol molecule attached to a DHA and an EPA and so on. And the easiest thing is at the end of that molecular distillation, you basically take that new chemical entity, which actually is no longer classified as an oil, and you put it in a capsule and you sell it as fish oil. When in fact, it's not actually oil at all. It's actually something we call an ethyl ester. And that's one of the reasons why they have to use these flavored gelatin capsules and so on, is because that actually, it's not very palatable. And so in order to go another step in the manufacturing process, either to make a good quality liquid or even a good quality capsule, what you end up having to do is then you have to then break apart that bond between the ethanol and the omega-3 and basically reintroduce the glycerol and recreate or recombine that mixture back into a triglyceride form. So it's not necessarily nature's triglyceride, but it is a triglyceride form that is exactly like what is found in nature, but now it's clean because you've gone through the molecular distillation process. And as you can imagine, that gets really expensive manufacturing-wise. But the outcome of it is you get a much, much higher quality fish oil and much more palatable. So in nature, it's a good form. It's that ethyl ester form, which is pretty hard to tolerate. And when people complain about swallowing fish oil capsules and then they get regurgitation in those fish burps, what I've seen clinically is almost every single case, I can't think of an exception, is because the person was consuming the ethyl ester form of fish oil, not the triglyceride form.
If you're shopping for fish oil, what would that say on the outside of the bottle that would clue you into one versus the other?
It's probably not going to say anything. No requirement for it. Interestingly enough, Australia will not allow ethyl esters to be sold in the country because, again, technically, an ethyl ester form of omega-3 is actually not an oil. So there's a few companies that will market it on the label to say it's in triglyceride form. But short of that, you can probably assume that if it doesn't tell you anything about the form, it's almost always an ethyl ester form if it's in a capsule. The other clue is the concentration. For example, if you have a 1,000 milligram capsule and it's 900 milligrams of EPA and DHA or 900 plus milligrams of omega-3s, it's almost always going to be an ethyl ester because manufacturing-wise, you can't concentrate triglycerides that much. The upper limit of being about 650 milligrams of omega-3s in a 1,000 milligram capsule. Anything higher than that is probably an ethyl ester.
For a person who has no sense of taste, no sense of smell, and really was just in it for the health benefits, the cognitive benefits, is there a reason to prefer one or the other?
Well, actually, now we get back to the absorption and the bioavailability. In fact, triglyceride form is significantly better absorbed than the ethyl ester. And there's a number of physiologic reasons. One is since a triglyceride form is the same as the natural form, it can be absorbed on an empty stomach or with food or whatever, because in fact it is food itself. Since ethyl ester is not food, since it's a different chemical entity, if you take it on an empty stomach, the bioavailability is terrible. It can be improved if you eat it with a fatty meal. The last form of omega-3s, which is krill oil. The big thing about krill oil is they like to say it comes in a phospholipid form, which is slightly different than what I've described before. And it's also found in nature. If you actually analyze a krill oil, yes, there's more phospholipid than there is, say, triglycerides or free fatty acids or any other form. But it's not 100% phospholipid. It's nowhere near 100%. So it's actually just a mix that came from a source of krill. And what I always look at is how many milligrams does that krill oil dose provide you? So if you got 50 to 80 milligrams of omega-3s in a krill oil dose, in an equivalent fish oil dose, you have 500 to 800 milligrams of omega-3s. In my mind, it doesn't matter how well absorbed that krill oil is, you cannot make up for a log scale difference in the raw material.
That reminds me of a Napoleon quote that quantity has a quality all its own.
Ultimately, what matters is how many molecules of EPA and DHA get absorbed into your system. And if you're starting with a log scale less, you're never going to be able to make that up. And so in order to provide the same amount of krill oil omega-3s to fish oil omega-3s, you have to use somewhere between 7 to 10 times the amount of krill oil. And krill oil is not cheap to begin with. So now all of a sudden you're talking 7 to 10 times the expense monetarily just to get the same amount of omega-3s in through the bioavailability type of system.
What do the defenders of krill oil have to say for themselves?
They'll always go to their marketing and they'll always say that the bioavailability is better and that it is lower on the food chain and so therefore cleaner. Well, if you're doing the molecular distillation, it's going to, whatever the product is, it's going to be clean anyway. There's nothing wrong with krill oil, just like there's nothing wrong with ALA, flaxseed, and so on. Krill oil has good hype and good marketing. As people often say, tissue is the issue, meaning it doesn't matter what you take and how you take it or how much you take it. What matters is the end state. How much of those omega-3s get to the brain or get to the heart to actually do their function?
One of the marketing things that we hear sometimes is that this is a fish that was caught naturally swimming in the rivers, swimming in the oceans, whatever, versus a farm-raised fish. In the cases of something that's going to be molecularly distilled down the production path anyway, does the actual origin of the animal in question matter at that point, or is that kind of irrelevant?
That's an interesting question. So ultimately, it doesn't matter the source. It matters what's in the capsule and what's available when you consume it. I guess theoretically, you could do farm raised and feed them flax and shorter chain omega-3s, and they'll get a longer chain omega-3s out of them. But I'm not sure that economically that makes much sense. If you go to a grocery store and they have fish that are laid out, and particularly look at the salmon. And if you look at the Atlantic salmon, 100% of it is farm raised versus the wild caught Pacific salmon. You'll notice one of two things. Either the colors are very different or the Atlantic salmon will have, and I think it's required, will have a statement by it that says color added, which is rather interesting. Why do you have to add color to fish to make it look like a healthy fish? Versus if you're eating a wild caught Pacific salmon, it's going to be a much deeper pink color because that's how nature intended it. Now, that's not just the omega-3s, that's the zeaxanthin. There's a bit of that, which a lot of that provides a pink color. So you think about it. You want this sort of sickly, almost grayish kind of fish that they call salmon, or do you want this beautiful, deep pink fish? And I can tell you what I would choose 100% of the time. I think ultimately what really matters is what's absorbed and what's reaching the target location, which from my point of view is not just the heart, but the brain. And that's where I focus my efforts to try to learn more and get the word out as what the benefits are for the brain, not just the heart.
For your own brain, your kids' brains, your family, your loved ones, what are your recommendations now in mid-2015 as far as what you're getting in your diet from plant sources, animal sources, supplementation? Where are you landing personally?
Personally, as far as that is, not always successful at it, but we try to eat relatively organic, relatively whole food, very few and very limited amounts of prepared or processed foods. Whereas 20 years ago, sort of a meat and potatoes kind of person, I'm much more of a meat and vegetable type of person. We're trying to do fresh vegetables, steamed or lightly grilled. Most of the time, we'll have a protein almost every day or every dinner, and some kind of meat source. That may be preferably grass-fed organic beef, but not always. Chicken, we pretty much have gone completely organic on the chicken just because you see these monster-sized chicken breasts, and the turkey breasts, the same thing. And at least once, if not twice a week, we'll try to have some kind of fish. We tend to stay away from carbohydrates as much as possible. And then we also do supplementation. So I now have a 15 and 17-year-old, and I can say since they were probably 7 and 9 years old, they have taken fish oil every single morning with breakfast along with multivitamins. So we'll take multivitamins and fish oil. Even since they were little, they have probably taken about almost 3,000 milligrams of omega-3s just in supplementation every single morning. They continue that amount up through today at 15 and 17 years old, as does my wife and myself. And if I'm struggling with a little bit of lack of energy in the afternoon, I'm more apt to actually reach for ALA or like a spirulina product for a little bit of energy to sort of get through that afternoon lull. I had a friend that was over the other day and he was drinking a Red Bull, and I was like, I honestly can say I have never had an energy drink like a Red Bull or Monster or any of those. I've never had one in my entire life. I would rather reach for spirulina or even another dose of fish oil. I'll just finish with one quick story on a research. Actually, the first patient that came into this research, we're putting him on 15 capsules of a good quality triglyceride fish oil. And we're going to do that for 5 weeks. Well, this first patient that came in was a very senior Marine. He was an explosives technician, had done multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan with special operations and lots of exposures to blasts, well-documented traumatic brain injury. And he was taking 4 grams of Lavazza, which is the pharmaceutical fish oil. We switched him from 4 grams of Lavazza to 15 grams of over-the-counter fish oil. And like by day 2, he was calling me up and thanking me. And basically what he said was, doesn't bother his stomach, has no side effects, and he felt 1,000 times better, both from the GI standpoint, but also mentally and cognitively by switching to a triglyceride, of course, in a much bigger amount. But that's, of course, what we're looking at with the study.
Is there any reasonable upper boundary, upper limit point at which the benefits turn into the famous inverted U curve where performance starts decrementing instead of incrementing when you get more of these in your diet?
I think for every individual, it's going to be different. And the reason why probably gets back to the status of the person to begin with. How many omega-6s versus how many omega-3s are found in that particular person, or how much they're consuming. And so there is going to be an upper limit in 2 ways. One is, when you take too much, your GI tract cannot absorb that much, and it's going to come out the other end and it's an oil. So it's going to come out the other end and it's not going to be necessarily pleasant. On the other side, the other concern would be that because it has such a profound positive effect on the immune system, that can be overdone as well. So it could potentially suppress the immune system for infections and so on. There's a couple other things. If you take too much, you can definitely get to the point where you bruise easier. Like if you were to take an aspirin a day, it's probably about equivalent to that. Not anything like if you're taking any of the major pharmaceutical blood thinners. And actually, let me just sort of throw in one more thing. The best answer, which doesn't get talked about nearly as much, is not so much about dosage, but is actually measuring it. And there's some decent blood tests out there. So the best thing to do is to know what your omega-3 levels are, what your omega-6 to 3 ratio is. And the only way to really do that is with a good blood test. And so that's the real answer, is it should really be followed just like cholesterol or just like blood sugar for a diabetic if you were going to really want tighter control. Is you could titrate down to the right amount of omega-3s. So what they would actually have to ask for would be a fatty acid analysis or a fatty acid panel. And so it's going to give you the main fatty acids, omega-3s and omega-6s being the most significant of them.
For people that want to learn more about what you're doing and sort of stay apprised of your latest learnings in the wide world of fish oil and beyond, what's the best way for people to find out more about you?
Well, the best way is the website. I started about 3 years ago, started a nonprofit, and it's a small nonprofit. The website is www.brainhealtheducation.org. And if a listener goes there, I would encourage you not just to explore the website. I put up a couple different protocols on there. One for severe traumatic brain injury, because I get a lot of inquiries about that. The other one is just basically labeled the Omega protocol. And I'm trying to get it a little more generic. Typically, that's for the people who are walking, talking, not in a coma, obviously. And they're able to swallow capsules or liquid, and it may be because they had a concussion. They may have had an injury years ago. I deal with some retired NFL players that are in their 60s and 70s, and so they obviously haven't played football in a number of years, and they found great benefit from doing the Omega protocol.